Ingrid had never truly belonged to any place, not to villages, not to hearths, not to the fragile promises of community that others clung to for safety and meaning. She had grown up on the far edges of the northern clan's territory, in a land where forests pressed against rugged mountains, and the threat of stronger neighboring tribes lingered like a shadow that never left. Daughter of a healer and a hunter, she learned early how to track wounded animals through deep snow, how to treat infections with crushed herbs, and how to fight when cornered. By the time she reached her teenage years, whispers had already spread through the scattered settlements. She moved through the woods with a quiet, uncanny precision, leaving almost no trace behind, reappearing only when she intended to. They called her the Snow Shadow, not because of magic, but because she possessed the rare, hard-earned skill of vanishing between the trees as though the forest itself swallowed her. Yet beneath that reputation, Ingrid carried a loneliness far greater than anyone imagined. Her mother had died young, claimed by a winter so merciless it froze entire herds where they stood. Her father had fallen during a failed expedition against foreign raiders who had crossed the Northern Sea. By 16, she found herself utterly alone. And in the eyes of her people, a woman without a family was not simply pitied. She was considered vulnerable, open to coercion, a target for alliances formed not out of respect, but out of convenience or greed. Rather than allowing herself to be pulled into a life chosen by others, Ingrid chose the forest. She chose the cold, the silence, the hard freedom of survival, because it was the only place where she could breathe without feeling the weight of expectations closing in around her. Years passed, and the wilderness shaped her into something both strong and solitary, a creature who knew the language of the wind and the signs left by wolves on fresh snow. It was this knowledge that led her, on the day her fate changed, to the trapped wolf cub struggling in terror, its small body caught between metal jaws. Without hesitation, she freed it, shielding it from predators and the cold. But the cub was injured, bleeding and trembling, and she could not leave it to die. So she carried it against her chest as she pushed through the thickening storm, the weight of snow growing heavier along her shoulders. Each step through the forest became a battle against exhaustion, against the throbbing wound on her side from her earlier fall, down a steep ravine, a fall that tore through her skin and soaked her cloak with blood. She pressed on, refusing to let go of the fragile life curled against her, driven by a stubbornness born not of glory, but of a lifetime spent fighting against circumstances that tried to crush her. The world blurred as fatigue began overtaking her. The towering pines twisted into indistinct shapes, and her legs grew unsteady until finally they buckled beneath her, dropping her into the snow that embraced her with deceptive softness. Darkness crept into her vision, her breath slowing as cold seeped deeper into her bones. Even then the cub stirred weakly under her cloak, and she gathered the last of her strength to hold it close, unwilling to surrender it to the winter's cruelty. Sounds reached her in faint, distorted echoes. Footsteps, perhaps voices, the dull thud of movement on packed snow. Her mind, slipping into unconsciousness, registered only fragments, a large shadow falling across her, the sensation of warmth as thick fabric was draped over her, the presence of someone powerful bending near. And as the world faded completely, Ingrid, woman without a home, snow shadow of the northern borders, was lifted away from death by the very man whose existence would alter hers forever, the king of the northern clans. Chapter 2. The days that followed passed with a weight that neither Lady Eleanor nor Oliver could easily name, though the household carried on with its usual rhythm, the soft echo of footsteps in the corridors, the distant clatter of servants preparing breakfast, the ever-present scent of lavender drifting from the garden. There was a quiet shift beneath it all, something unspoken threading itself between them. Eleanor tried to return to her routines, tending to her embroidery, reading in the sunlit corner of the library, walking the grounds in the early hours of the morning. Yet her thoughts kept circling back to Oliver, to the unexpected gentleness she had seen in him, to the sorrow she sensed lingering behind his composed demeanor. She had always known him to be reserved, but lately his silences carried a different heaviness, as though he were guarding a truth he could not allow himself to speak. Oliver, for his part, busied himself with the responsibilities of Hartley Manor. The estate had grown in complexity over the years, and he found solace in its demands. He oversaw the ledgers, met with the tenants, inspected the stables, and walked the borders of the property as though making sure nothing slipped out of place. But even in his diligence, he felt the subtle pull of Eleanor's presence, her quiet concern, her lingering glances when she thought he wasn't looking, the way her voice softened whenever she addressed him. At night, when the manor fell into silence, Eleanor lay awake wondering what had changed in him, or perhaps what had changed in herself. She remembered the countless seasons spent in his company, yet this one felt different. There was an undercurrent she could not fully grasp, as though life at the manor was shifting, preparing for something she could not yet see. And Oliver, standing by his window one evening, while the last traces of twilight faded behind the hills, wondered if Eleanor sensed how deeply she had become part of his world, far more than he had ever allowed himself to admit. Their days continued in quiet parallel, two lives moving side by side, steady yet tinged with an unspoken tension. Neither of them yet understood that the peace of Hartley Manor was beginning to unravel, thread by delicate thread. Chapter 3. Autumn arrived with a quiet, relentless beauty, painting the Hartley lands in tones of copper, gold, and fading green. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, and the winds swept gently through the fields as though urging change upon everything they touched. Eleanor felt it instantly. Her walks grew longer, her thoughts heavier, each day pressing a little more insistently on the uncertainty she could no longer ignore. Oliver also sensed the shift, though he attempted to drown it beneath duty. But even he could not escape the subtle unease settling over the estate. The tenants spoke of unusual tensions in the nearby village. A distant cousin sent word of a matter demanding Oliver's attention in town. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one leaving him more withdrawn, more contemplative. Eleanor noticed the way he folded them with deliberate care, the way the lines around his eyes seemed deeper afterward, as though the words carried a weight he could not share. The household staff felt it too. Whispers drifted through the hallways, speculations about what might be troubling the master of the manor, yet none dared ask, for Oliver's composure, even in its uncertainty, remained unbroken. Still, Eleanor saw what others did not: the fleeting pauses in his step, the distant look that overtook him at unexpected moments, the tension in his shoulders whenever he thought himself alone. She longed to approach him, to break the barrier that had somehow grown thicker between them, but she also feared crossing a boundary neither of them could easily retreat from. One afternoon, while standing at the edge of the orchard, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. Life at Hartley Manor, steady, familiar, predictable, was changing. Something was approaching, slow but inevitable, and though she could not name it, she felt its shadow stretching across her days. Oliver, returning from a ride that same evening, felt a similar foreboding. As he dismounted and looked up at the manor glowing softly in the dusk, he sensed that nothing ahead would be simple. Not his responsibilities, not the letters awaiting him on his desk, and certainly not the growing, unspoken connection between himself and Eleanor. The season was shifting, and with it their lives. Chapter 4. The unease that had quietly taken root within Hartley Manor deepened in the weeks that followed, spreading slowly through every corner of the estate like a shadow lengthening at dusk. Eleanor felt it most during the early mornings, when the mist curled low over the rolling fields, and the world seemed suspended in a silence too heavy to be natural. Her footsteps echoed differently on the gravel paths, and even the birdsong seemed subdued, as though nature itself sensed a shift she could not yet define. Oliver, meanwhile, grew more distant with each passing day. He continued to fulfill his duties with unwavering precision, yet something in him had changed. His movements became more deliberate, his expressions more guarded, and the brief moments of quiet warmth he once allowed himself in Eleanor's presence grew rare. Often he retreated to his study long after the household had retired for the night, and the faint glow beneath the door became a familiar companion to Eleanor as she passed through the corridor before bed. She wondered what occupied him so completely, whether it was the estate, the letters he continued to receive, or something deeper, more personal. The servants whispered discreetly of troubles beyond the manor's walls, matters that perhaps Oliver was attempting to shield from those around him. Eleanor tried to dismiss their speculations, but the evidence was difficult to ignore. She had seen him pause more frequently near the windows, staring out with a distant expression, as though searching for answers in the darkened landscape. On one such evening, While she stood near the library's tall shelves organizing a scattering of books, she sensed him nearby. He had stopped in the doorway, his posture tense, as if debating whether to speak or retreat. For a moment their eyes met, and Eleanor felt the unspoken weight of everything he carried, the responsibility, the burden of unshared truths, and something else she could not fully decipher, something that flickered like a fragile flame behind his composure. But Oliver merely gave a faint nod, an acknowledgement both courteous and painfully distant, before turning away. That night Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. She lay awake listening to the soft whisper of the wind, tugging at the manor's old window panes, her thoughts circling endlessly around the growing distance between them. The change was unmistakable as the shift in the season itself. She feared that whatever troubled Oliver would soon shape not only the estate but the lives of everyone within it. As days passed, subtle changes in the manor became more pronounced. A messenger arrived twice in the same week, an unusual frequency that did not go unnoticed. Supplies requested from the nearby village came with delays and excuses that hinted at broader tensions. Even the tenants seemed restless, their greetings more cautious, their expressions weighed by concerns they hesitated to voice. Eleanor wandered the grounds one chilly afternoon, her fingers grazing the brittle tips of withered leaves, and realized how deeply the atmosphere around her had transformed. Hartley Manor, once a place of steady tranquility, now felt like a landscape waiting for a storm. And somewhere within it, Oliver stood at the center of that quiet whirlwind, carrying burdens he would not share, drifting further from the person he had once been in her eyes. Yet beneath the growing distance, Eleanor sensed something profoundly fragile, an emotion neither of them dared acknowledge. It lingered in the air between them, subtle but persistent, a quiet hum beneath the uncertainty. She could not name it, but she felt its presence like a promise and a warning intertwined. Change was coming. She could feel it with every breath, and whether it would break them apart or bind them closer, she did not yet know. Chapter 5. Winter laid its claim upon the land with a quiet but relentless certainty, and Hartley Manor seemed to withdraw into itself as the cold deepened. Frost clung to the windows each dawn, forming delicate patterns that resembled fractured feathers, or the branching veins of trees stripped bare by the season. Eleanor felt the chill seep into her bones, not merely from the weather, but from the lingering tension that threaded through the estate like an unseen fault line. Days passed in a muted rhythm, each one carrying the same heaviness that had settled over the households and hearts within the manor. Eleanor continued her tasks with steady diligence, yet she found her thoughts drifting ever toward Oliver. His absence had become a strange presence of its own, filling spaces he no longer entered and echoing through moments once shared in quiet understanding. She rarely encountered him now except in passing, and when she did, he seemed wrapped in a layer of distance she could not penetrate. His gaze, when it met hers, held a depth of conflict she could neither read nor soothe. She sensed that something was pulling him away, something far larger than the estate, perhaps larger than either of them. On one particularly cold morning, the sky heavy with the threat of snow, Eleanor ventured into the woods that bordered the estate, seeking clarity in the silence of nature. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky. As she walked, the only sound was the soft crunch of frost beneath her boots. The solitude offered a strange comfort, yet her mind remained unsettled. She found herself recalling the early days of her time at the manor, when Oliver's presence had been steady and approachable, when unspoken understanding flowed naturally between them. Now those memories felt distant, as if belonging to another life entirely. She wondered when the shift had begun, when the warmth had first begun to fade, replaced by something guarded and heavy. Perhaps it had always been there, a quiet undercurrent she had never noticed until it surged to the surface. As she approached a small clearing, Eleanor paused, sensing a change in the atmosphere. The air felt sharper, charged with the kind of tension that precedes a revelation. She remained still, absorbing the quiet, her breath forming pale ghosts in the cold. It was in that silence that she realized how deeply Oliver's turmoil had begun to shape her own days. His burden, though unspoken, cast a shadow that reached her even across distance. She did not know the nature of the storm gathering around him, but she felt its edges creeping closer to her world with every passing day. Returning to the manor, She noticed subtle signs she had overlooked before. The servants exchanging glances, the steward speaking in hushed tones near the entrance hall, the way Oliver's study door remained locked more frequently than usual. Something was undeniably shifting, and the estate braced itself as though awaiting an inevitable change. That evening, while preparing candles in the dim corridor outside the study, Eleanor paused, sensing movement beyond the closed door. The faint rustle of papers, the soft scrape of a chair, and then silence. She stood there for a long moment, torn between the desire to knock and the fear of intruding upon secrets not meant for her. In the end, she simply listened, the distance between them feeling both painfully small and impossibly vast. As the first snow began to fall that night, blanketing the estate in a quiet white veil, Eleanor realized that the season's transformation mirrored her own sense of uncertainty. The world was changing, reshaping itself under forces beyond her control, and she stood at the threshold of something she could not yet name. Whatever path lay ahead, whatever truths waited beyond the silence, she felt instinctively that this winter would alter everything. And somewhere within the storm's quiet beginnings, Oliver remained a figure both familiar and unreachable, a man she cared for more deeply than she dared admit, even to herself. Chapter 6. Snow continued to fall in silent sheets across the estate, softening the edges of every familiar path and turning Hartley Manor into a world suspended between breath and stillness. Eleanor felt the days blend together beneath the muted light of winter, yet something within her shifted with each passing hour. She had tried to occupy herself with her duties, moving through the manor with the composed grace expected of her, but the weight of her thoughts made even the simplest tasks feel heavy. It was impossible not to feel the growing distance between herself and Oliver, but beneath that distance lingered something even more difficult to ignore, the unmistakable pull of affection she had tried so long to quiet. She had assumed it would fade with time, that her heart would learn restraint, yet it only grew more pronounced, rooted in memories of small gestures and stolen glances that now felt achingly far away. She felt it in the way her breath caught when she saw his silhouette at the end of a corridor, in the way warmth rose to her chest when she remembered moments of quiet understanding between them. Oliver had become a presence she carried within her, no matter how far he drifted, and he was drifting still. In those days, Oliver began spending long hours riding through the estate's boundaries, returning each evening cold and withdrawn. He seemed worn by a struggle invisible to the rest of the world, as though he battled something he could not name. Eleanor sensed that whatever troubled him had begun to take root long before she arrived at Hartley Manor, a burden he had learned to conceal beneath duty and control. She saw the exhaustion in the curve of his shoulders, the resigned tension in his movements, the way he hesitated before meeting her eyes, as if afraid of revealing too much. Yet she also sensed moments of hesitation, fleeting instances when he seemed on the verge of reaching toward her, rather than away. One evening, while she arranged candles in the corridor near the drawing room, she caught sight of Oliver standing at the window, his expression unguarded in a way she had not seen in weeks. He looked lost, as though torn between the life he lived and the one he wished he could claim. Eleanor paused, not wanting to disturb his solitude, yet unable to walk away. She felt her pulse quicken as she watched him, not for his stature or the commanding presence he carried, but for the vulnerability etched deep within him. In that moment she understood with painful clarity that her feelings for him were no longer something she could ignore or dismiss as passing admiration. They had taken hold of her completely. Later that night, in the quiet of her room, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had long avoided. She cared for him deeply, deeply than she had intended, more deeply than she had believed herself capable of after a life marked by caution and restraint. The truth unsettled her, yet it felt undeniably real. But with that truth came fear. She knew Oliver carried responsibilities far beyond her reach, burdens she did not fully understand. She knew, too, that their worlds were not easily aligned, separated by expectations, status, and the silent rules that governed the manor. Even so, her heart refused to retreat. Over the next days, she began noticing small changes in Oliver's behavior. He lingered a moment longer when passing her in the hall. His gaze softened when he found her in the library or near the garden doors. Though he never spoke of what troubled him, Something in his presence shifted. As the winter nights stretched longer, Eleanor found that hope, quiet and fragile, began to rise within her. Perhaps the distance between them was not an ending, but a threshold. Perhaps beneath the silence there was a connection neither of them had yet dared to face. The first time this thought occurred to her, she felt foolish for entertaining it, but as hours turned into days, she could not shake the sense that something was changing within Oliver as well. And though uncertainty still lingered, she felt the faint stirrings of possibility, like warmth spreading through cold air. She sensed that their paths, once parallel, would soon converge in ways neither of them could avoid. Whether it would bring solace or heartbreak she could not yet know, but she felt the shift as surely as she felt winter's breath on her skin. Something was coming, something that would demand truth from both of them, and for the first time in weeks she felt ready to face it. Chapter 7. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar tension, one that lived not in conflict but in anticipation, as though the very air around Hartley Manor sensed the quiet shift taking place in the hearts of those who walked its halls. Eleanor felt it most acutely in the early dawn hours, when pale light filtered through her window and the stillness of morning made every emotion sharper. She found herself drawn to the estate's quieter corners, seeking solace in the solitude of routines that had once comforted her, yet now felt charged with meaning she could not put into words. She moved through her tasks with greater care, her senses attuned to every change in Oliver's presence. Something within him had softened, though the precise nature of that change remained hidden beneath layers of restraint and unspoken turmoil. She noticed it in the way his steps slowed when she passed, in the thoughtful pauses that lingered between them, in the faint but unmistakable warmth in his expression when her gaze met his. These moments, fleeting yet powerful, kept her awake at night with a mixture of hope and fear. She wondered if he sensed the same pull she felt, if the silence between them carried echoes of something deeper they both hesitated to acknowledge. Oliver, too, seemed restless in a way he had not been before. He spent less time isolated in his study and more time walking the grounds, often stopping before the edge of the woods as though contemplating a path he had long avoided. Eleanor watched him from a distance on several occasions, noticing the conflict etched in the lines of his posture. He looked like a man torn between duty and desire, bound by expectations, yet yearning for something beyond them. One afternoon, she ventured into the garden despite the lingering chill. The last remnants of autumn had long since vanished, leaving only the skeletal remains of branches reaching toward a pale sky. She took comfort in the quiet, letting the cold air clear her thoughts. As she paused near the frost-dusted stone archway, she sensed movement behind her, and turned to find Oliver standing a short distance away, his expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakably purposeful. The world around them seemed to still, the hush of winter deepening as though nature itself waited for whatever shift was about to unfold. Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken, not from fear, but from a fragile hope she scarcely dared to hold. Oliver stood there for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words written across his features, yet he remained silent, bound by a restraint she knew had shaped much of his life. And though no words passed between them, something unhidden flickered in the quiet space they shared, an acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them with a steady, relentless force they neither could deny. Later, as Eleanor returned to the manor, she felt a strange warmth rising in her chest, a sense of nearness she had not felt in months. She knew, with a clarity that startled her, that the distance between them was closing, that whatever burden Oliver carried, whatever turmoil had kept him withdrawn, was beginning to loosen its hold. But with this realization came a new fear of hope itself, fragile and easily shattered. The nights grew colder, the estate darker, yet Eleanor found that she no longer felt the oppressive loneliness that had once accompanied her steps. Something within her had awakened, a steady flame that glowed even in the deepest winter. She sensed that a turning point was near, that the truth long held in silence was finally approaching the surface. And as she lay awake beneath the quiet weight of the night, she could not shake the feeling that her life was on the verge of irrevocable change. Whether that change would bring joy or heartache she could not yet know, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to embrace it. Something within her whispered that hope, though fragile, was often the beginning of everything. And as the shadows lengthened and winter deepened, Eleanor felt the steady pulse of something far stronger than fear, an emotion that had grown quietly, steadily, impossibly, until it filled every corner of her heart. Chapter 8. Winter reached its deepest quiet, settling over Hartley Manor like a final, lingering breath before the world began to change again. The snow lay heavy upon the earth, muffling sound and softening the harsh outlines of stone and branch, and within that stillness, Eleanor felt a shift she could not yet name, but sensed with every beat of her heart. In the days that followed, Oliver's presence grew impossible to ignore. He appeared more often in the corridors, more grounded in the manor than he had been in months, moving with a steadiness that suggested he had made some private decision, one that eased the tension that had long shadowed him. Eleanor felt it each time she crossed paths with him, a subtle but unmistakable pull that seemed to draw them closer, not by chance, but by inevitability. She felt as though the silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a space waiting to be bridged. One morning, after a night of relentless snow, Eleanor left the manor to gather supplies from the small shed near the edge of the grounds. The sky hung pale above her, its vastness softened by drifting flakes, and the air carried that quiet hush that only winter mornings possessed. As she made her way back toward the estate, she saw Oliver standing near the garden archway, his figure framed by frost-covered stone and winter-bare branches. He turned when he heard her approach, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He looked different, not in appearance but in presence. There was no visible weight on his shoulders, no trace of the distance that had kept him closed off. Instead, there was a calm resolve in his expression, one that stirred both hope and fear within her. The space between them felt charged, filled with months of unspoken emotion, and even without words she understood that whatever had kept him silent was no longer strong enough to hold him back. She felt her heart lift, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniably alive. He took one step toward her, then another, and though he said nothing, the truth in his eyes was unmistakable. He had chosen to stop running from whatever tied them together. He had chosen, at last, to face it. Eleanor sensed her breath catch as realization washed over her. For so long she had feared that her feelings were hers alone, that the connection she felt was only an echo of hope she had been foolish enough to nurture in silence. But now, standing before him beneath the quiet winter sky, she understood that he had felt it too. Every shift, every moment, every fragile thread that had slowly woven itself into something neither of them could ignore. Winter wind drifted softly between them, carrying the faint scent of frost and pine, and in that stillness, Oliver reached out, not with words, not with grand gestures, but with a presence so open and vulnerable that it spoke louder than any declaration. He stood before her not as the master of the estate, not as a figure bound by duty or expectation, but simply as a man who had finally allowed himself to feel. Eleanor felt warmth bloom within her, deep and steady, melting through the cold that had long surrounded her heart. All the loneliness, all the uncertainty, all the careful restraint she had carried for months seemed to dissolve under the quiet certainty of that moment. She had spent her life believing that belonging was something fragile, something easily lost, something offered only to those who fit neatly into the world's expectations. But standing there, she realized that belonging could also be something chosen, freely, willingly, bravely. Oliver chose her, and in the unspoken truth of that choice, she found a sense of home she had never allowed herself to imagine. The heaviness that had filled the manor for so long seemed to lift, replaced by something softer, something full of possibility. Winter would not last forever. Seasons would turn, snow would thaw, the world would open once more. And for the first time, Eleanor felt ready to meet that change with something greater than fear. She felt ready to meet it with hope. As they stood together beneath the falling snow, the world around them quiet and still, she understood that this moment was not an ending but a beginning built not from certainty or perfection, but from courage, truth, and the quiet strength of hearts that had finally learned to trust their own longing. The future remained unwritten, shaped not by expectations but by choice, and Eleanor felt something within her settle into a peaceful certainty. Love, she realized, did not always arrive with grand declarations or sweeping revelations. Sometimes it came quietly, growing in the spaces between shared silences and unspoken understanding. Sometimes it came in the form of two people who had weathered their own storms and found, at last, the courage to step out from the ruins of their solitude. As winter snow drifted in soft spirals around them, Eleanor knew that whatever lay ahead, she would no longer walk alone. And for the first time in her life, that single truth was enough to fill her entire world with light. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story until the end. If it touched your heart in any way, remember that your own journey also holds strength, courage, and new beginnings you may not even see coming yet. Stories remind us that we are never truly alone, and it is an honor to share moments like this with you. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes all the difference and allows us to keep creating content that inspires, moves, and stays with you through the next chapters of life. We are deeply grateful to have you here. Until the next story.